Well, thank you for joining us. My name is Martha Cole, and I work at the Montana Historical Society. I'm our Outreach and Interpretation Program Manager. And it is my great pleasure tonight to introduce Candi Zion. Candi was born and raised in Montana, and she inherited her love of Montana history from her father. At an early age, she was intrigued by the history of the 19th century Métis settlements located in proximity to their family cabin on the Rocky Mountain front. She received her MA in Historic Preservation from Arizona State University, after which she worked as the Missoula Historic Preservation Officer, managed the Historic Facilities Program for the Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Department, and as an independent consultant, she documented and surveyed numerous neighborhoods and historic buildings. She continues as an independent consultant, conducting cultural resource and oral interview projects through CZ Consulting, and she's also a member of the Board of Trustees for the Montana Historical Society. Most significantly for this talk, she's the author of 2 books, In Between People, The Métis of Central Montana, and Walking Down the Middle, the Hi-Line Metis, and she'll be available to sign those books after the talk. So with no further ado, let me introduce Candi Zion.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here with you tonight. Thanks for having me and being interested in this subject. I also want to give a special shout out to the Montana History Foundation, because if it hadn't been for them, these books might not have been written. So because of the Montana History Foundation, I wrote 2 grants that were awarded to me, and I was able to do these oral interviews of people. And it's been just a wonderful process. These books came from that. I had a chance to meet some marvelous people, learn some interesting things about folks on the way. So I've got books back there. I also have my dad's books. He was a homesteader and a house mover. And in fact, that's how I became interested in the Métis, was because of him. We had a cabin up out of Shoto on the North Fork of the Teton River, and the Métis settlement, one of the bigger ones, was on the South Fork back in the turn of the century, the 19th century. So I knew a lot of the history, knew a lot of the descendants, and since my dad was a house mover, he had a lot of Métis crews. And Métis, do people know what Métis is? Oh, okay, so some do and some don't. All right, well, so Métis, it means mixed blood. It's French for mixed blood, and it can be a mixed blood English, French, Scottish, European ancestry with Native American, generally Chippewa Cree. That's mostly who we're speaking of here, Assiniboine also. There's other tribes too, but specifically the people I talked to were of those three tribal nations. So getting back to my dad though, so these big crews he had, that was back in the day when you'd move houses and grain elevators. You'll see on one of the books he moved a huge grain elevator with 2-ton trucks. I mean, this is really amazing what he did. But they use these railroad jacks, and they're about this tall, and you hand jack them. So you build these cribs, and they're these timbers that are about this long, and they're 8 by 8, 10 by 8, depending. So you'd stack those up in a crib formation, and then put the jack. You'd crib, you'd jack, crib some more, jack, and that's how you'd move these houses up and then back the trucks underneath and go. Well, I got a chance to work with my dad on these jobs, and I did a lot of flagging, but I also did a lot of cribbing, and I did some construction work for him too. So, but the guys were Métis that worked for him. So I had a chance to talk to them and know them, and since I was a little girl, we'd go up to Hill 57 where a lot of folks lived. Do you know where that is in Great Falls? Okay, well, Hill 57, when you go to Great Falls, if you come on the frontage road, there's that little bar, I think it's called the Frontier Bar, I think is what it's called. Anyway, on the frontage road, and off to the north are these kind of hills up here, and that's where Hill 57 is, and Royal Butte, and that's where a lot of Métis people ended up. Some of the folks I interviewed were settled in that area, or were from that area, were descendants of folks that lived there. So, getting back to the Métis people, so that's the reason I became interested in them, is because what a fascinating history. They were persecuted horribly in Canada. So getting back to why there were this mix of people in the first place, it's because there were French trappers, English trade, Hudson Bay Company, there were other fur companies that were going on, and it was a big rush to see who could have the biggest empire, the biggest fur empire there. Well, what's the best way to be successful if you're a European in a country that you don't know anything about? You talk to the people that live there, and you don't just talk to them, you get to know them, you become part of their families, you marry into their families. And so this is what happened, is we had a lot of families, mixed blood people. It made sense. It made sense economically, strategically, to work with other tribes to find out where the good trapping was, and then also to be safe, you know, because you didn't want to, you want to take your life in your hands just going out there and being a white guy out amongst anybody else. I wanted to get back to, before I go any further, thank you, Montana Historical Society, for doing this too. Greatly appreciate it, and to the library for putting this on too, for helping us. So I appreciate that. I didn't want to forget you. I don't want to forget you because you guys are very important to me. As you know, since I'm a board of trustee there, I'm really, really very fond of this. And I'm so glad that all of you are patrons too of the Historical Society. It's so good to see people that have the same interests. All right, so getting back to the folks up in Canada, there is a place called Rupert's Land. And it's a huge, huge land area right around Hudson Bay Company. And so this was some of the land that Hudson Bay had, and they'd set aside for families that were of mixed blood, because it got to be generations. You know, we're talking of the early 1800s and going on into the 1860s, well, it would have been 1850s, somewhere right around in there. But, you know, that's several generations of people. So they established themselves on farms, little places, ranchettes, places that they could make a living and doing different things besides just trapping. It'd be, you know, wood hawking is a good example of an economy that they're very successful at too. They just the kind of people that, they were jack of all trades. They would do anything they could to make their family successful. Catholic faith was very important to them. Priests would go out with a Métis, and when they had, let's say, buffalo hunts, for example, the priests would go and bless these hunts, and they would, you know, harvest the animals wherever they could, Canada, into Montana, North Dakota. So they would follow certain paths of harvesting animals, different plants for their subsistence. So what happened was, good old Hudson Bay, you know, they're like anybody else. It made sense to get out at some point economically for them. Fur trade was not that good anymore. So they changed plans in the middle. Canadian government looked like they were going to start taking over everything, and so that's what happened. So the Canadian government said, look, you know, you guys have this great land up here that you've been farming and living on, and you know, it just so happens you're indigenous people, so you're part native and you're part white. You know, we don't really know what you are, and we don't really know how to treat you, and probably we're going to treat you on the bad side because you've got that native side to you. And all right, so remembering too that Catholic people of Catholic faith, children very important, and very successful in establishing large families. And thank God they were Catholic, because the priests recorded family histories in Canada. If you want to do some research, if you have any relations there, or if you are Métis and want to find out, you can go to just about any of those repositories for those types of records. And I mean, it's amazing what you can find out. They are documented down from way back. So one thing I wanted to ask you, are there any of you that are French from Canada? Oh, okay, we are French from Canada. All right. What about English from Canada? Okay, so Native American from Canada. All right, so my question is to you. You said you were French from Canada. Are you of Métis background?
No, my grandmother and grandfather were both from Three Rivers, Quebec. The grandfather came to Marysville to help his uncle run a bar.
I see it, from Marysville. And what was the name?
DeRozier, we say. They call it Desrozier up there.
DeRozier. All right. So the reason I ask is because I've done some talks before where I asked that same question, and one lady said, okay, she told me her name, and I said, well, that's a Métis name. Do you know that? She said, no, I didn't know that. We've always were told that we were French. And this is what I found interviewing people too, is that they didn't admit they were Indian. A lot of the ancestors, they would tell their descendants that they were French, and they spoke French. So everybody just assumed, well, they were French. So that's why I asked that question, is because the one lady in particular, she got me aside after the talk, and she said, well, I want to know more about this because I think I'm Métis. She said, I had no idea. I just always thought, I had no idea we were part Indian. I thought we were just French. So I told her where to go to look to find out her background information and go from there. So you said, okay, now you're Potawatomi. Tell me this. You're Potawatomi and French?
Yes. Yeah, from the Potawatomi, from the Great Lakes area, but the family, or the Truchon de Levere family, married into the Potawatomi group. And so that's my French connection, Canadian French connection to your question.
Oh, that's interesting. So how did your family end up in Montana, or did you just come?
That's a long story.
Too long to tell today? Well, maybe later we'll have to talk about that. Okay. So just imagine what it would be like to have this beautiful place. Let's say you're on the Red River and you're Métis and you've got this, you have your wonderful family, and you've got this great place, and the Canadian government comes in and tells you, nope, you're out of here. Well, that didn't go over very well, did it? So Louis Riel was, he was a fantastic leader. He was very religious. Some people thought he was crazy because he was very fervent in his belief. So it depends on who you talk to, especially in Canada, what their thoughts are about him. But there's no doubt that he was a very charismatic leader and was able to get people to gather together and fight the Canadian government. So if you can imagine, I mean, we're not talking about a lot of people compared to the Canadians and the rest that were fighting against them. So the Métis, they were able to stave them off. So this happened, it would have been in the 1880s, ending with one of the worst rebellions in 1884. So just imagine women and some of the children loading their husbands' rifles or their whatever kind of armatures that they had, with bullets whizzing over their heads, because a lot of them may be hiding down in the thickets on the Red River trying to defend their places. And could you just imagine that, to have to defend your place because somebody wants to kick you off the land, and your chance is just a snowball in Hades. You don't really stand a chance. It's going to end up badly for you. So, and that's kind of what happened. It ended up that a lot of the Métis families moved into Montana, and we see in this book, I talked about the families that went to central Montana, and they came about the 1870s, 1879. Now remember when we talked about the cyclical hunting of people hunting for buffalo in different places in Canada and down through Montana, North Dakota, they're following the herds and following the kind of robes too. So, you'd go one place for winter robes in your buffalo, you'd go another place for summer robes in the buffalo, you'd go another place to go antelope hunting, you'd go another place to go deer hunting, and you'd go someplace to pick sarvice berries. They always had these different places that you would go and camp, and so it was kind of like this cyclical pattern. So they knew a lot about Montana and North Dakota. I mean, they knew what this country was. They'd been here. This was their country. They had no idea about any parallel between, any line between Montana and North Dakota and Canada. That was just, why would you even bother? That's just a fake thing that white people know about. So here they are, transported, coming back into Montana, trying to figure out a place where to light. And about 1879 is when they started building Fort Assiniboine. That's a fort on the Hi-Line that's outside of Havre, and that's why Havre is where it's at right now, is because of Fort Assiniboine. And that was a very strategic fort for the U.S. Army, because that fort was one of several in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming that basically were part of their plan to surround the Native Americans. Well, this include the Chippewa and the Creek. So remember, we're going back, Métis families are made up a lot of Chippewa and Creek people. So, and there's Blackfeet components too. Well, so they were trying to surround all of these native tribes and make sure that they had the control. Well, if you ever, have anybody been to Fort Assiniboine? Oh, fantastic. Well, good. And if you haven't been there, you need to go. The buildings are phenomenal. The architecture is beautiful. And when you go, you realize that the United States was making an impression on the people of what their power and strategy was, because these buildings were substantial brick, huge, beautifully constructed, and on a plan that is similar to all of the forts of that same time period. So they had these templates that they'd build these forts and of these buildings, and they're just beautiful, but very imposing. So anyway, 1879, folks come down. Some of these families came in waves to the Lewistown area, and they went by Fort Assiniboine. They came by and also saw Chief Joseph down there by Cow Island, and they saw how terrible they looked and in rough shape before their terrible conflict that's there in the Bear Paws. And they settled kind of near, well, down on Big Spring Creek in that area. And Lewistown, you all been to Lewistown, haven't you? Yeah, well, you know how pretty it is. I love Lewistown. I mean, it's just an absolutely gorgeous place. They call it the snow hole. A lot of the natives called it that because in the wintertime, you know, like right now, it's, you know, you don't have snow, nothing compared to what they have down there right now. You know, it's just the way it is. But it's kind of cool because those families came and they settled and thrived and established the town of Lewistown, basically. You know, and we don't give them enough credit. Lewistown is there because of Métis families that settled. We've got the Lavenders, the Donis, the Janus, the Bergers, you know, I mean, you just go on and on and on with all the families, and we talk about them in here. And I had a chance to meet the descendants of all of those families, which was really fun, really fun. I was kind of disappointed that Lisa couldn't come today. We were just talking about it, the guys back there. They're good friends with Elisa, and Daniel is also Little Shell. So you did not raise your hand, I noticed. But yes, yeah, that's okay. We're good with that. But Elisa is very involved, and so am I with this memorial. It's that we're going to erect at Lewistown. Little Shell is involved heavily with this, and it's a grave site that there was a cemetery of these Métis families, and it talks about it in this book here. And the families in the cemetery were unearthed because there's conflicting, we were just discussing that earlier, conflicting information about really what happened. The rancher said, oh, I don't really want a cemetery on my place, you know, it's disrespectful, we need to have them interred in a Catholic cemetery, and, you know, going on and on. But then the other side is, well, yeah, you don't want a cemetery on your place because then your land value that's going to go way down, and I can't sell it in the future, and who wants a cemetery on their ranch? So that then, who knows, it's probably maybe a little of both, maybe it's one or the other. So they buried them, reinterred them into a mass grave at Lewistown. But it turns out it's not a mass grave, it's more than one mass grave. And we know that because we had a guy with ground penetrating radar come out and check it out, and there's more than one grave site there. But they took all the bones and commingled them, and you know, they didn't have a choice because they weren't buried in formal great caskets. You know, they were buried in whatever wooden thing, whatever blankets they had. So, you know, when they reopened the graves in the 1890s, here's all these, you know, the bones are there, and well, we don't know, just put them all together. So we don't know specifically who. We know who most of the people are. There's probably, well, I don't want to tell you numbers, but it's in here. I don't want to give that information away, but a lot of people. So we're going to put this monument up there to commemorate them. But the Métis, again, they're very critical in the establishment of Lewistown, and not just Lewistown, but like Augusta, Gilman, places like that, Havre, all of the towns on the Hi-Line. I mean, all of those Depuyer is one, Shoto. I mean, you know, I can just go on and tell you about all the places where Métis people settled to, and they also settled on the Blackfeet Reservation. So moving on to this book, then that was my second grant, and that's the Hi-Line. Well, I lived in Havre for a while. My husband is from there. We're ranchers, and Jeff Solomon, he's a cattle buyer too, and so he was raised there. So I thought this is perfect because I know a lot of the people up there that are Métis, and I know a lot of the people that are out there on the reservation too, on the reservation there, Rocky Boy. So perfect, you know, I'll just go and talk to a lot of these folks. And I had a chance to interview people that were Métis from Browning to Wolf Point, which just was a great experience. I think, I gotta tell you about Dutch Lunik though, because he was one of my favorite interviews. Do you know Dutch? Oh, this guy, he is a character, and I want you to buy these books because people's stories are so fascinating. You know, and don't ever think your own stories are meaningless or your family stories, because they have so much meaning, and your lives have so much meaning to other people, and you just don't realize how rich you are yourselves. And I would encourage you to do your own oral interviews of your family members. You know, write it down, record them. It's simple. There's programs like Microsoft 365 that you can plug into your computer, and it'll download your interview for you. It doesn't spell really great, but you know, that's important for you to recognize that oral history is a very significant part of our background, and our own is very important. So anyway, back to Dutch Lunik. So he's one of the guys that we've known for a long time because he's a rodeo contractor, and my husband and I rodeoed for years and years. And I still barrel race, and so, you know, I know his daughters and have a connection there. And he was, besides being a rodeo contractor, he was also a stuntman in Hollywood and also an actor. So he was one of the first Native American actors that was in a lot of the movies like Dances with Wolves. You know, when they started really recognizing, instead of using white people or Mexican people to play those parts. And okay, so I really want to tell you this story, but I want to tell it like he told it to me, and I would use his accent. But if it would offend anybody, I don't want to do it. But if it doesn't offend you, I want to do it.
What's the person's name again?
Dutch Lunik. Alvin Lunik is his name. So is it okay if I do it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so unless somebody raises their hands and say, no, I'm going for it. Okay. Because he was telling me about one of my favorite movies. Oh, and his great-great-grandfather was a mountain chief. So do you know who Mountain Chief is? Okay, some people do. Mountain Chief was a great warrior chief of the, he made sure and told me that. He was a warrior chief of the Blackfeet. And he was told when they established the reservation, he said the government told him, you cannot go any farther than Chief Mountain. So that's, Chief Mountain is named, Chief Mountain is that big mountain that's kind of a square-like one as you're going up to Glacier Park. Yeah, you probably know that. So, right. Well, that was his boundary. They said, you cannot go past that mountain. That's your mountain, but you cannot go past that. So, but he was a big warrior. That's why. They didn't want him getting off too far on the reservation. Well, his son was Owl Chief. And Owl Chief, now, Malcolm Clark, have you heard that name? Okay, Malcolm Clark. All right, so the Sebin Ranch that's outside of town here, there's a little cabin there, and Malcolm Clark was killed, let's see, I don't know, was it 18? I'm not sure exactly the date on it now, I'm not going to tell you. But anyway, does anybody know the date when he was killed? Okay, 69? Is that when it was? Oh, okay, okay, all right, thank you for that, perfect, okay. So Malcolm Clark was killed, and we're not sure the exact reasons why. There's been some contention about what, that it was horses maybe, you know, the horses, money didn't get transferred back and forth, the horses disappeared, and then he was married to Owl Chief's relation, and that didn't set very well either. So Owl Chief ended up killing him. Well, remember, this is Dutch's relative, so I just want you to remember this. This is Dutch's relative. Okay, so he tells me about this movie, and it's Running Free is the name of it, and it's a story about this yearling horse, which got my heart right off the bat, and it's, I think it's in Africa or someplace like that, Saudi Arabia maybe, but the horse, it's during World War I, I believe, or one of the wars, maybe that's not the right one, but anyway, the horse is orphaned, and so he grows up, and it tells his story basically. So it's the horse in this wilderness, this desert wilderness by himself. So one of the scenes is there's the horse and the lion is there trying to attack the horse. And I was always so impressed by this scene because it looked like he's gonna get that horse. You know, how did they do that with this lion? Well, the guy that was the animal trainer was named Sled Reynolds, and apparently he is a very famous animal trainer for the movies. And so he tells Dutch, this is what we're gonna do. He gives him the plan, and he said, all right. And I said, okay, this is the one where there's a scene with the horse and a lion. How'd you get that scene? Well, then he got telling me about this oryx that they trained. We broke an oryx, you know. Sled, I'm not gonna take the accent yet. Sled is a wild animal guy anyway, so every day, 2 to 3 times a day, you worked with them lions. And we had a cheetah, oryx. I didn't help him train him, but I'd hang around and be kind of his assistant, you know, and go around, but he was real good at that stuff, just being persistent. So how'd you get the scene where the lions are really hungry? Okay, now I'm gonna talk like him. Starve them, get them hungry. And then we was baiting them with the chicken. Ha ha, that was my job. I had a chicken on a fishbowl. Ha ha. I was sitting about from here to that shed out here, so that what we do is we feed that chicken right there, and we kept him hungry too. He'd be pecking, and then they'd turn that lion loose, and I'd reel that chicken in. And we both are just laughing hysterically, because the way he's telling us, you know, he just is so animated. And he'd say, reel that chicken in on the fishbowl, ha ha. That lion would run right up and chase that chicken. And then, but they had him on a cable, so he could only go so far, and then he'd have to stop, see? And then I'd get my chicken out of there. Then we'd sit down, drag the leg back, in where he goes, and then set our chicken back down. Shit, I'd sit there with my fishbowl, watch that lion come after me, and then we'd laugh like heck, you know. I'm thinking, how, you know, and they did this. This didn't happen just 1 or 2 or 3 times. This happened all day. They did this scene all day long. So he had to sit there while this lion is chasing him. You know, it's crazy. So I'm telling this story because this is the kind of stories I got out of people. You know, it wasn't just their ancestors, it's themselves. You know, it's your stories too, you know. That's why it's so important. So yeah, I love Dutch. He's just really quite a character, that guy. And his daughters are quite the ropers and barrel racers. So the other thing that I think was really neat too when I wrote this book is I got to interview one of my friends who is a barrel racer and her mom, and they were see, I got to find them because her ancestor was pretty phenomenal. But it was so cool because her little girl told me, her little girls are barrel racers, you see, so you know, it's so much fun. And she told me, she said, I took the book to school to show and tell. I said, you did? She said, yes. She said, I got to show everybody that my picture in there. So I'll show you which one it is. And they're just adorable. So she got to show her the picture. She's this one little girl right here to all the kids in show and tell. Now that's another reason that oral interviews are so, and your oral histories are so important, is because of these kids right here. Just think of that. She's going to always remember that, and now she thinks her ancestry is important. She didn't know that. She didn't know it was important to be part Indian. And in fact, her mom, when I called her, said, you know, I always thought she was part Indian, but I wasn't sure. So I said, Jen, are you part Indian? She said, well, yeah, I guess so. I really don't know that much about it. So I got to talking to her, and I said, well, who are your family members? And she started telling me who they were, and they were Troches. Well, Troche is a big name. You know, it's a big Métis name. Those people were very, very influential and fought in the Riel rebellions, signed the petitions to try to get land in Montana, which were unsuccessful. But this is her ancestor, and proud, a super proud people, just tough. They knew how to fight. These guys knew how to fight. But I said, well, you're Métis. And she goes, Métis? What's that mean? I didn't even understand what that means. And so I explained it to her. So there's another generation, somebody that didn't know who they were, that now they know that she knows who she is, and that it's important. And that's one thing I found in writing these, is that people went, oh, you mean you actually care that I'm part Indian and that I'm Métis? Yeah, I care, and a lot of other people care too. And it's been a real awakening for folks, and of such interest to me to see folks realizing how important their ancestry really was. Because a lot of the ones, especially folks in Lewistown, when I'd talk to them and I said, well, what did your grandparents tell you about who you were and where you're from? And they said, well, we're French from Canada. And like we were discussing earlier, you're French. But they would say, well, yeah, we're French. We're not really Indian. And they would disown it. And all of the paperwork that I looked at of marriage certificates, birth certificates, death certificates, they would say white, 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 when I knew that they were 3/4 to a half Native. And I knew that wasn't the case. But just imagine how much easier your life is in that time period, really that time period when they came to Montana to not that long ago, to just say that you're white and make life so much easier for yourself. So it was closed-mouthness, closed mouth. People didn't talk about that part of their ancestry. They only talked about the French side. One thing I also noticed in folks that I talked to, there are a lot of people that served in the military, very proud of military service, and impressive. One of the fellows from up at Rocky Boy, John Montos, he didn't serve overseas, but he was one of the guys that would unload the transports of all the coffins that came home from Vietnam. And it affected him because he also loaded the soldiers onto the transports to go to Vietnam. So he saw those guys going, and then he saw them come back in the coffins. And so he's been in counseling ever since then, and since they died, they started offering counseling for that kind of thing. So, but military service, very proud, a lot of Purple Hearts. One lady's husband rescued another gentleman, received Purple Heart for it, just good-hearted people. And I think a lot of it too, maybe because the struggles that they had to endure might have something to do with that too. Not an easy life. There's one family in Lewistown that actually grew up in a cave. In the summer times, they lived in a cave. And I know this because the lady's mother was a superintendent of the schools, and they'd have to go do checks on the children. And they went to the cave, and there was a family of, she said every year there was a new baby. And it was clean, but it's a cave. And two of those boys ended up being in the military service, and one was another one that was highly honored. And I wonder, maybe one reason they're so good and get these medals and do so well in battle is because they're just tough. They live in a cave, for example. So let's get back to this one here. It's walking down the middle. I called it this because Gary McDonald, he's a county commissioner up at Wolf Point, and he's Métis. And he was telling me that he didn't even know he was Indian until he was in his 20s. And the only reason he found that out was because he's blonde-haired, fair-skinned and such. He was pumping gas, and one of the guys came up that was on tribal council and said, so, Gary, are you going to pump gas the rest of your life? And he said, well, I don't have enough money to go to school. And the guy says, you don't have to have money to go to school. You can go on a tribal scholarship. And he says, yeah, right. I'm white. I can't do that. And he said, no, you're not white. You are part Indian. And he said, no, you got to be kidding me. No, yeah, he was. And he said, well, how can I go? If I'm partying, how can I go? You are enrolled. So he was enrolled in Turtle Mountain and didn't even know it. His mom had enrolled all of the kids in Turtle Mountain, and none of the kids knew it. None of them knew it. So when he found out, then he spilled the beans, and everybody's mad at mom, because she's, God knows all the whole deal. And again, closed-mouthness, just so much easier to just don't say anything about it. Just lay low. You're blonde, you're going to slide through life pretty easy. But he was really fun. He introduced me to his buddy, Stanley Moran, and Stanley had suffered a stroke. So it was hard for him to talk. And he was very concerned when I interviewed him that he wasn't going to sound good. I made sure that if there were places in the book where he'd skip, and kind of or big spaces, that didn't show. And I think he was really happy for that. But he talked about the jigging, how important jigging was, and a lot of the traditions, which a lot of people that I discussed this with, they didn't have traditions. There weren't, a lot of maybe bullets and fry bread, something like that, at New Year's, which is kind of a traditional meal for a lot of Métis people. But a lot of traditions weren't used by following, because again, closed mouth, it wasn't passed on down. But there is one, Elisa Herodes told me this one, and it's in one of these books, that her grandma told her, and the women will appreciate this too, she said, we have a special use for cattails. And Lisa said, well, what would you use cattails for? And she said, well, it's for that time of the month that we use cattails for. So that was their sanitary means for that time of the month. And she was absolutely horrified, of course. But that's another one that didn't know that she was Métis until later on in life too, and she cried. It was just like, you gotta be kidding me. Nobody told me this in the first place. And then, just what a shock to not have this information and to be able to follow it and just make life interesting, because it's an interesting history. Let's see, let me take a look at some of the other people I might want to tell you about too. Well, one thing, when the folks came out of Canada, and they came to Montana and they came to North Dakota, there were different bands, several different bands of people. Some of the bands that ended up at Turtle Mountain were Little Shell, Rocky Boy, and Little Bear. So they're Chippewa and Cree. They're not one or the other. Some Little Bear was Cree, the others were Chippewa. Well, they ended up at Turtle Mountain, but what happened was the government was, they're not thrilled about all these Indians coming into the states or the territories. They were just not. They were not thrilled. They were trying to keep them back, kick them back for years. In 1896, Pershing came out of Fort Assiniboine, and they had a massive, massive gather of people, Métis people, Cree, Chippewa people. They burned homes, they burned settlements, they burned teepees, they killed livestock, they rounded folks up. I even know an account of, I think Al Wiseman told me this, that when they marched him through Shodo to go to Shelby, they didn't pick up the people that were in the South Fork Canyon because they were so well hidden. They didn't even know that those people were there. And there was like 120 families that lived back in there. So they were well hidden. But they had all these other folks, 400, 600 people that they marched and put on the rail. Well, so they put them on the rail, get them across the line. They turn around, they beat the cavalry back to Fort Assiniboine. So they all come back, they don't understand what's going on in the first place. So these roundups were not, they just didn't work very well. They weren't very successful. But it's sad because they were just gathering whomever. They didn't take the people of Lewistown because the people in Lewistown had businesses. They were more well entrenched, and so they just left them alone. So they left some families alone. They left the families alone at Fort Assiniboine that were helping them, that were part of making their fort exist. So they were left. So they march all these people, they all come back. Crazy how that happened. So back to North Dakota, Turtle Mountain, we've got the government again is trying to say, well, okay, you guys, we have to figure this out. You've got all these people here. We're not going to give you all this land. So they cut down the reservation size, and they told Rocky Boy and they told Little Shell, no more. You're gone. And this was not just the government, but this was a political thing too within the tribal factions. There were some tribal factions that could not get along. So those people split off. Well, Rocky Boy is the one that's at Havre, right? That's the reservation there. And that's what happened. Rocky Boy was able to eventually get some land. And he actually never got to live there because he died before the reservation was given to them. But it was because of him why they even have that land now. And Little Bear, he kind of assimilated in with a lot of the other different tribes. But Little Shell, well, we know 2019, right, Daniel?
Yep.
That's when they finally were federally recognized. What was that, 157 years, you said?
157 years for recognition.
Yeah.
That would be the Old Crossing Treaty in Minnesota when we were negotiating with the U.S. government.
Isn't that something? So 157 years to finally be recognized, The U.S. government was just always trying to say, well, you're Canadians. You need to go back. And so they did. They kept exporting people back, and they kept coming back in again. And everybody's related, So these families are huge, remember? We're good Catholic families. We have lots of babies, and we intermarry with the Chippewa, the Cree, the Assiniboine, and the French, and the Métis, all, we all know everybody else, and we're all related. Well, some of the families, like Dutch Lunick, some of his folks ended up in Browning, which a lot of them did. They ended up on the Rocky Mountain front, all down that front, but also on the reservation there, and married into a lot with the Blackfeet. And like Dutch, he wouldn't tell me exactly what happened to his dad, but his dad was killed, and I have a suspicion that it was a family member that maybe did it, but he didn't want to tell me specifically what happened. But his father was a really good-looking man and wrestled in high school and was really well-liked and very popular. But more of these other stories about the backstories of their own families. But going back to the way back, Rocky Boy, like I said, he didn't get a chance to live there. But a lot of the families, like the Montos, they were not part of the Rocky Boy clans, but they were accepted, kind of adopted, more or less, by the Rocky Boy people to come in. So they could have been Little Bear, they could have been Little Shell, they could have been somebody else, because a lot of times the families would adopt them in because they're all interrelated anyway in a lot of instances. Now, one thing I want to talk to you about, again, Hill 57. That place, when I was a little girl and my dad and I would go up there to pick up some of the guys to go to work, and sometimes we had to go to jail and get them out of jail and then take them back to their homes at Hill 57. That was part of it too. But I remember when I was a little girl going up, and the houses were just basically ramshackle shacks with dirt floors, and in fact they were burning batteries, and some children were killed by the fumes from burning batteries in the winter times. That was a rough place up there. And they lived there. A lot of the Métis people lived there because they were working at Anaconda Copper. They were working at the stockyards, at the kill plants, any place they could find any kind of work. And there were some settlements around the kill plants too. But being Anaconda Company workers was not very easy for them. And you can just imagine in the 1920s, 1930s, when life was tough and there wasn't a lot of extras, everybody's in competition. Some of the families were burned out because of they're working for Anaconda. It's a jealousy thing. It's, why are you working? You're Indian. I'm a white guy. I'm out of work. I should be working. You're an Indian guy. So there's a lot of clashing animosity there. A lot of folks were burned out. But this three people that I talked to at Rocky Boy, one of the fellow that introduced me to them actually was a tribal chair at one time for Rocky Boy, and his father-in-law was one of the people. I won't say names because it has to be anonymous, his father-in-law was one of the people I interviewed, and so there's 3 folks in their 80s, including this father-in-law. And they didn't want me to interview him, so I showed up. I drive all the way from Winifred across that horrible road, if you know what that road's like, from Winifred across the river, Big Sandy to Havre. It's gravel and it's a Bearcat if it's been wet and they don't go, which they never grade it, it's just the way it is out there. So I drive down there and they go, I don't know. I don't think I want to talk to you very much. Who are you? And they're looking at me up and down, because they're looking at me, you're a white girl. What do you want to talk to us for? So, and my friend, he's like, well, see ya, bye. So he splits. So I'm here with the 3 people going, okay, how is this going to work? So I had to talk to them for a while before they felt comfortable to even discuss anything with me. And the reason they didn't want to talk to me is because they were so pissed at Mike Mansfield and that group of legislators at that time, because they said they came out to Hill 57, because they lived out there at Hill 57. They came out, they saw how bad the conditions were in the roads, and they didn't do a diddly thing to help. Nothing. In their minds, they did nothing to help. She said, I had a picture of Mike Mansfield I put on my wall, and I threw darts at it. That's how mad she was at Mike Mansfield. But they were so interesting. They finally loosened up, and I said, all right, your story's got to be told. Okay, how about if we do this, if you just let me do it and you guys be anonymous? Okay, all right, well, that'll work. So then we got to talking, and okay, here's just a picture of Hill 57, just to let you know, if you can kind of see. The conditions were it was really tough there. Well, they still weren't really loosening up to me very much, and I said, well, my dad, he hired a lot of guys that lived out there, Jarvis and folks like that, McDonald's and Jarvis, Clarence? Yeah, so then I was cool. Then they wanted to talk to me and open up a little bit more then, so that made it really fun then. So when they knew that Candi Zion was my dad, well, you're a cool girl now, so we'll talk to you. But you got to buy the book, because their stories it's sad. At the end, they talk about, one of the ladies didn't know how to read and write, and she learned how to read because one of the ladies that was so kind to bring papers, and a Christian lady, she would bring her papers and she taught herself how to read. And and she's in her 80s, so what does that make? She's born in the 1940s? That's kind of late, you think about it, but that was the way the conditions were. And I've got some information here about the kids up there at Hill 57, and they didn't go to school, a lot of them, and the ones that did go to school, they ended up having to be educated separately than the white kids. They ate separately than the white kids, and they had to clean up after the white kids. So, to think that, if anybody should be mad at white people, it should be a lot of Métis, but it's not that way. One of my friends that I interviewed that was our neighbors, the Latrays, she talked about how her great-great-great-grandfather is the one that built the first post office in Lewistown. And they had the broad axe. I had a chance to see it, this big broad axe that they used to hew the logs. My goodness, that's hard work. But she talks about how, we just wanted to help. We just wanted to just tell us what you want us to do, and we can help you. We can be the interpreters. We can trap furs for you. We can get game for you. We can bring wood to you. Just let us know what you want to do. And I thought that was pretty cool. I'm thinking, how are we doing on time? Is that what the time actually is? Have I talked that long? When are we supposed to be out of here?
Well, this would probably be a good time to open it to questions, but before, I just need to let people know this is being recorded, and so for the folks who are going to listen back home, I'd like you to raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll bring the mic to you so you can speak in the mic.
Oh, great.
Just a point of clarity, Hill 57, is that Black Eagle?
No, it is not. Hill 57 it's actually west of Black Eagle. So it's those buttes as you're coming into town. There used to be, I don't know if you remember, there used to be they called it the Cowboy Monument. It was a big obelisk on top of the butte, and one of the ladies talks about how somebody blew it up. And then they'd had all their names carved on there, so they're so mad about that. But it's those first buttes on the north side as you're coming in right there into Great Falls.
The northwest bypass.
Yep.
When you're heading out of town, heading down I-15.
And Hill 57 was named after Hill. It was Great Northern Railroad property, and you could not pick up Indians off a railroad right away and move them to Canada. So it was kind of a sanctuary that he turned his head to them, and the only income he got from that, he rented, Heinz put 57 up on the hill, Heinz 57. So that was where the name of that is. But, you know, when you were talking about Little Bear and Rocky Boy and Little Shell, Chief Little Shell, Rocky Boy was Chief Little Shell's nephew, and his uncle was Little Bear. You consider him Cree, but his father, Big Bear, was a full-blooded Chippewa, and he was named Cree by the government because he became the head band leader for the Mayapot Confederation of the Chippewa, Cree, and Assiniboine. So then people that wrote that did that, and they made everybody Cree that was a landless Indian in Montana. If you were off reservation, they said you were Cree, and that was a Canadian Indian, and they exported you. And the worst part of that exporting you is they took your possessions and burnt them. So you were poor to start with, and afterwards you were poorer, but you had to come back home to even less. So it was really tough up there to be an Indian, even if you were on a reservation, because they come and got your children and sent them to boarding school up until 1977. So it was a lot of times much easier to be white and just not say you were Indian because of the persecution you receive from that. But it is great to see people come out and start writing our history and admitting it, and letting people be able to be proud of being an Indian, because it's an honorable thing. I know I was come home as a youngster crying from school, and my grandfather asked me why, and I told him I'm being picked on for being an Indian. And he told me, he says, you know, in this country, a lot of people came to this country, but the lucky ones met the boats. So you were the lucky one.
Thank you for that.
Are there any other questions or?
Does the term Métis, apply farther to the south in terms of the French influence in around New Orleans, for example, and the Creole or Cajun?
That's a different, yeah. It's actually different, since that the other side is that more of the indigenous natives that are in the northern tier, as opposed to that southern influence of indigenous and Spanish French. Yeah.
What relationship did the Turtle Mountain have with Métis? I imagine there were Métis there as well as what came out to Rocky Point.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, Turtle Mountain definitely. Was probably, I think, wasn't Turtle Mountain the first reserve for Chippewa and Cree people? Chippewa.
It was an early one, but the Red River
True that.
ran north into Canada. So it wasn't part of the Louisiana Purchase. It wasn't until the 49th parallel that we became American. But it was that thing, and you got a lot of Métis that come down from Manitoba because of the Louis Riel's first revolt was in Manitoba in I think 1869 or something like that, when they came in and they lost all their land there, and that pushed a lot of them into the Pembina, and there was a real push for that to be Pembina, Minnesota, to be annex all of that into the United States instead of Canada. So there was a real political uprising there. So that's what made Pembina and that Red River country with Turtle Mountain so important, because of it was the end of the railroad.
This isn't a question, but a comment. Last summer, we were in Winnipeg, and the hotel we were staying at happened to have a conference of the Métis. And I don't know, there were several hundred there. But in Winnipeg, there is actually a museum to Louis Riel. If you go to the very beautiful Museum of Human Rights, it goes through the history of the Métis and tells how he was vilified, and now he's actually a hero in that area.
You had a chance to go through then, obviously?
Yes.
Oh, fun. It'd be fun.
Well, with that, I'm going to say two things. One is I hope everyone will join us in 2 weeks when Brenda Waller will be speaking about Marcus Daly's Road to Montana, his early life. I hope that you will, after thanking Candi, stop by and if you want to pick up a book or look at a book. And thanks so much for coming. And thank you, Candi.
I'd like to thank Candi for the name of her book. One's in the middle.
Oh,
That's a big deal.
you know, that was Gary McDonald is the one that said that. He told me that, so I quoted him. I said, all right, Gary, that's what I'm going to call my book.
Good, yeah, that's, because there is some Métis, they call it the day of decision, and it lasts longer than a day. But if you were